"Mommy, I don't want to be a wife. I still play with dolls." Those were the words Amira al Zahara whispered to her mother the night before her forced marriage. She was only 10 years old. 2 years later, she died trying to give birth to a child her body was never meant to carry. In Yemen, tradition and survival blend in deadly ways. Amira paid with her life for a culture that turns girls into commodities and calls it honor. This is the story of how a doll was traded for a wedding veil, and how the veil became a burial shroud. In a small village in the Hodeidah province in Yemen, Amira al Zahara was born in 2010. The daughter of an impoverished family lying in a mud house with a tin roof, she grew up in a world where girls learned to carry water before they could ride their own. Amira was a child like any other. She laughed loudly when playing with her rag dolls, dreamed of one day learning to read like the village boys, and ran barefoot through the hot sand chasing butterflies. But in Amira's world, being a girl meant childhood came with an expiration date. By age 8, she was cooking over a wood fire. At 9, she helped her mother with all the household chores. And at 10, well, at 10, others made decisions that would define and end the rest of her life. Before we continue, Amira's story became part of this community that refuses to forget voices like hers. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any story that needs to be told. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching it from? Because stories like Amira's need to be heard everywhere. To understand what happened to Amira, you need to understand where she lived. Her village was a place forgotten by time and by the government. Dirty roads turned to mud during the rainy seasons. Homes were made of sun-dried brick that cracked under the scorching sun. There was no electricity. Once darkness fell, the only light came from smoky oil lamps that burned through the night. Amira's family lived in a single room that housed 7. Her father, Ahmed al-Zahara, worked as a day laborer on local farms when there was work. Some days he came home with the equivalent of $2. Other days he came home empty-handed. Her mother, Fatima, had never set foot in a school. She woke before dawn to fetch water from a communal well nearly a kilometer away. In this world of absolute scarcity, every mouth to feed was a cruel math problem. Amira and her 4 siblings competed daily for portions of rice and bread that were never enough. Most nights the children went to bed hungry. When there was food, the boys ate first. They would work one day, their father said. The girls ate whatever was left. For families like Amira's, a daughter was seen as a temporary burden. Unlike boys who might one day bring income home, girls were just mouths to feed until they could be transferred to another household through marriage. The sooner that happened, the better for the family budget. It was a perverse kind of math, but it was the only one they knew. It was on an afternoon in March 2020 that Ahmed al-Mansouri arrived at the al-Zahara family's home. At 28, he was considered a good match in the region. He had a small spice shop, a house of his own, and, more importantly, money to pay a dowry. Ahmad had seen Amira a few times at the local market and decided she would make a suitable wife. Her age wasn't a problem from him. It was actually a plus. Young girls adapt better, he told Amira's father. The conversation between the men lasted less than an hour. Ahmad offered the equivalent of $800 as a dowry, a fortune to a family surviving on less than $50 a month. For Ahmed al-Zahara, Amira's father, that money meant food on the table for nearly 2 years. It meant the difference between surviving and starving. The decision was made even before Amira even knew her life was being negotiated. Amira was not consulted, not even informed at first. She found out 3 days later when her mother called her in and, avoiding her gaze, said, "You're going to get married, Amira. It's a blessing. Ahmed will take good care of you." Amira, who was still playing house with rag dolls, didn't fully understand what that meant. "Can I take my dolls with me?" she asked innocently. From that moment on, Amira's childhood began to be systematically dismantled. She was forbidden from playing outside. A bride shouldn't expose herself like that. Her dolls were put away. "You won't need those anymore." She began receiving lessons on how to be a good wife. Lessons no 10-year-old should ever have to hear. Meanwhile, in the village, everyone congratulated her father for his good decision and for the luck of securing a husband for his daughter so quickly. And so, just 2 weeks after that 1-hour conversation, Amira found herself wearing a wedding dress that was bigger than her own body. The wedding took place on a Friday in Amira woke up that day still hoping it was all just a bad dream. But when the village women arrived to dress her, reality hit her in the cruelest way. The white gown was far too big. They had to use pins to fit it into her small frame. The makeup couldn't hide the obvious truth. This was a child, not a bride. Throughout the entire ceremony, Amira remained silent. She didn't understand the words being said about her, to her, or for her. When the time came to say yes, her voice came out as barely audible whisper. But no one asked her to repeat it louder. No one asked if she was sure. The yes of a 10-year-old child was accepted as valid and final. After the ceremony, while the adults celebrated with food and music, Amira was taken aside and instructed on what would happen next. For the first time, she began to truly understand what it meant to be a wife. The terror in her eyes was clear, but it was dismissed as normal bridal nerves. When the sun set, Amira was taken to Ahmad al-Mansour's home. She carried a small bag with her only belonging, 2 changes of clothes, and hiding at the bottom a small rag doll she had managed to save. It was all that remained of her childhood. That night, at just 10 years old, Amira ceased to be a child, not by choice, not by maturity, but by the force of a tradition that devours its own daughter. Ahmad's house was bigger and better than her parents', but to Amira it became the most luxurious prison a child could know. In Ahmad al-Mansour's home, Amira discovered that being a wife meant being a servant, a substitute mother, a property at all at once. At 10 years old, she was responsible for cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, and meeting every need of an adult man. Her tiny hands could barely lift the heavy pots, but any complaints were seen as laziness. Ahmad laid down strict rules. Amira couldn't leave the house without permission. She couldn't speak to neighbors. She couldn't cry where he could see. "You're my wife now," he told her. "You have to learn how to act like one." To Ahmad, that was discipline. To Amira, it was the end of the only word she had ever known. What tormented Amira most was the silence. In her parents' home, despite all the hardship, there had been laughter, conversation, life. In Ahmad's house, there was only orders and expectations. She had no one her age to talk to. The neighbor women treated her like an adult, expecting her to understand references and responsibilities that were years beyond her comprehension. At night, after Ahmad fell asleep, Amira would secretly put out her rag doll and whisper to it. It was her only connection to who she truly was. During the day, she hid the doll under the mattress. If Ahmad found it, he'd say she was being childish. But Amira was still a child, just a child, forced to live an adult nightmare. As the months passed, Amira began to change in ways that frightened even her. She stopped smiling entirely. She developed trouble sleeping. She lost her appetite for days at a time. When Ahmad asked what was wrong, she didn't know how to answer. At 11 years old, she didn't have the vocabulary to describe depression, trauma, or psychological abuse. She only knew that something inside her was dying a little more each day, and it was in that state of complete emotional deterioration that, freshly 12 years old, Amira received the news that would seal her fate forever. Amira didn't understand at first when Ahmad came home, smiling more than usual. She didn't get why he suddenly began treating her with more care. It was only when he called in her mother-in-law to better manage the situation that the truth became clear. Amira was pregnant. To Ahmad, this was a point of pride, proof of his manhood, confirmation that he had made a good choice. He immediately spread the news around the village, receiving congratulations and pats on the back from other men. "Your wife will give you a strong son," they said. To Amira's family, it was confirmation they had made the right decision. She was fulfilling her role. But Amira's body told a different story. At 12 years old, she had barely developed secondary sexual characteristics. Her hips were narrow, her skeletal structure was still forming. Biologically, she was a child trying to carry the biological burden of an adult woman. It was like forcing a young branch to bear the weight of an entire tree. Something was bound to break. From the very first weeks, Amira's pregnancy was difficult. She vomited constantly, not just in the mornings, but all day. She lost weight instead of gaining it. She experienced back pain so intense it left her doubled over in agony. She had dizzy spells that sent her collapsing to the floor. But every time she complained, the response was always the same. "It's normal. All women go through this." Not all women went through that. Only children forced to become pregnant did. Amira's body was desperately trying to communicate that it wasn't ready, that something was terribly wrong. But in a culture where women's pain is normalized and medical questions are a luxury only the rich can afford, the silent screams of her body were dismissed as drama or weakness. As months passed, Amira became a shadow of herself. Her skin turned pale and tight. The sparkle of childhood vanished from her eyes. She walked slowly, always clutching her back or belly. She slept poorly, ate even less. Her ragdoll, her last childhood refuge, was finally abandoned. There was no longer room in the bed for it, and the swelling growth taking over her tiny body. Ahmad grew irritated by her weakness. He expected her to keep cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the home as before. "My mother worked until the last day of her pregnancy," he'd said with disdain. He didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, that his mother had become pregnant at 20, not 12. That having a fully developed body makes all the difference between life and death during pregnancy. When Amira entered her third trimester, she could barely get up on her own. Her legs were so swollen they no longer fit into her shoes. Her breathing became labored, as if each movement was a battle against her own biology. But the response remained the same. It's normal. It'll pass. The truth no one wanted to face was that nothing about this was normal. Amira's body was sending desperate distress signals, biological warnings that a tragedy was on its way. But in a society that teaches women to endure pain in silence and treats children as property, those signs were systematically ignored, until it became too late to ignore anything. The first contractions began on a Tuesday, just after sunrise. Amira had been trying to sweep the yard when a sharp pain bent her in half. She screamed, a sound Ahmed had never heard before. When he rushed to see what had happened, he found Amira clinging to the broom, her face contorted in pain, a pool of fluid forming between her legs. "It's time," said Amira's mother-in-law, who had been called in a hurry. No one thought to call a doctor, no one considered a hospital. Births happened at home in the village. They always had. What could be different this time? But everything was different. Amira wasn't a grown woman giving birth. She was a child whose body was attempting to perform a function it wasn't biologically prepared for. Amira's contractions were different, more violent, more erratic. She screamed in a way that made neighbors close their windows. Her narrow hips created an impassable birth canal. Her undeveloped muscles weren't strong enough to produce the necessary contractions. It was like trying to force something too big through a space far too small. It could only end in destruction. By nightfall, Amira had lost her voice from screaming. Her skin was drenched in sweat. Her lips, once rosy, had turned pale. On Wednesday morning, she could barely keep her eyes open. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring incoherent words. In moments of clarity, she called for her mother in the frightened voice of a little girl. Throughout the second day, bleeding began. Not the usual blood of childbirth, but something darker, heavier. Amira started running intermittent fevers. Her body was clearly in shock, but the explanation remained the same. This is normal. She'll make it. By Thursday morning, Amira could no longer scream. She panted like a wounded animal, her eyes rolling back, her skin taking on the gray hue of something losing the battle for life. Only then, after 3 full days of agony, did someone finally suggest a hospital. Not for Amira's sake, but because it became obvious she might die, and a death at home could bring legal trouble for Ahmed. When Dr. Yamin al-Rashid saw Amira arrive at the hospital, her first thought was, "This is a child." As the medical team scrambled to stabilize her, she asked Ahmed about the girl's age. "She's almost 13, he replied without shame. "She's my wife." The doctor felt a chill, not just at the medical horror unfolding, but at the casual way a 20-year-old man spoke of being married to a child. Amira was in hypovolemic shock due to the massive blood loss. Her blood pressure was critically low. The baby, who should have been born 3 days ago, was in several fetal distress. But most horrifying was the internal damage. 3 days of obstructive labor had caused intensive lacerations that now threatened her life. Dr. Yasmin assembled an emergency team. 2 obstetricians, an anesthesiologist, 3 nurses, all working against the clock in a situation that should never have happened. "If she had arrived on the first day, we could have done a C-section," one doctor muttered. "Now we're trying to fix 3 days of destruction." The first priority was stabilizing Amira. Blood transfusions were started immediately, medications to raise her blood pressure, oxygen to aid her failing lungs. Meanwhile, the fetal monitor showed weak, irregular heartbeats, a life fighting to survive inside a body collapsing under the weight of what had been forced upon it. The decision was made. Emergency C-section. Operating on Amira in her condition was risky, but it was the only chance to save either life. Dr. Yasmin explained the risks to Ahmed, who signed the consent forms with the same indifference he had shown when signing the marriage contract 2 years earlier. The surgery began at 6:45 p.m. Under normal conditions, a cesarean takes about 45 minutes, but nothing about this case was normal. Amira's uterus was so damaged from 3 days of unproductive contraction that surgeons had to proceed with extreme caution. At 7:23 p.m., the baby was delivered. A boy, silent, blue. The team worked desperately to resuscitate him. Chest compressions, ventilation, medication. For 15 minutes, they fought to bring life into that tiny body. But 3 days of suffering in a hostile womb had taken their toll. The baby that Ahmed had so proudly announced never took a single breath. Meanwhile, Amira was fighting for her life on the operating table. The doctor discovered extensive internal damage, what they technically called an obstetric fistula, a devastating condition caused by prolonged labor. Her uterus had ruptured in multiple places. Other organs were affected. It was like trying to repair something had been systematically destroyed over days. Dr. Yasmin worked for more than 2 hours trying to repair the damage. Transfusion after transfusion, suture after suture. But Amira's body had already gone beyond what it could endure. Her heart, which had fought bravely 12 years and 9 months, began to fail. At 9:47 p.m., the monitors began to emit continuous beeping. Amira's blood pressure plummeted. Her breathing became irregular. Dr. Yasmin and her team performed CPR for 45 minutes, but it was like trying to revive a body that had suffered too much trauma. At 10:32 p.m. on a Thursday in December, Amira al-Zahra was pronounced dead. She had never turned 13. She had never kissed a boy by her own choice. She had never decided anything important about her life. And now, she would never get the chance. When Dr. Yasmin exited the operating room to deliver the news, she found Ahmed sitting on the hallway, checking his phone. "I'm sorry," she said. "We couldn't save her, or the baby." Ahmed nodded, as if receiving a weather report. There were no tears, no despair, just detached acceptance that his wife had finally broken. Later, Dr. Yasmin would write in her report, "Maternal death due to complications from obstetric labor, an extremely young patient." But in her personal journal that night, she wrote something else. "Today I witnessed the murder of a tribal cultural negligence, and there is no prison for that." Amira's funeral was held the following Friday, a small, quiet, almost secret ceremony. The local imam spoke about the will of Allah, and how some flowers are picked early for the heavenly garden. No one mentioned that Amira was a child. No one questioned the circumstances. It was more comfortable to speak of destiny than responsibility. 3 months after Amira's death, Ahmed al-Manzouri began looking for a new wife. To him, Amira had been a failed investment. This time he was more selective. He looked for a girl slightly older, stronger, as he put in. The $800 he had paid as Amira's bride price was considered a total loss. No one offered a refund. No one felt responsible for the defect in the product. In Ahmed's mind, he had been just as wronged as anyone else. After all, he had lost a wife and an heir on the same day. When asked about what happened, Ahmed developed a convenient narrative. Amira had been too weak for motherhood. Some women simply aren't made to have children. He explained with medical authority he did not possess. It was genetic, fate, bad luck, anything but human responsibility. The al-Zahra family faced both grief and financial ruin. The $800 dowry had been spent months earlier. Ahmed al-Zahra began speaking about his daughter as if she had been a heroine who had fulfilled her duty to the end. It was easier to turn Amir into a martyr of tradition than admit he had sold his daughter to her death. Fatima sank into a silence that would never be completely broken. She continued household chores mechanically, but avoided any conversation about weddings, children, or the future. When women talk about arranging marriages for their young daughters, Fatima simply walked away. 6 months after Amira's death, it was as if she had never existed. Her home had been occupied by Ahmed and his new wife, this time a 15-year-old girl. Amira's cloth doll had been burned along with other belongings of the deceased. Her name was no longer mentioned in family conversation. But in an unlikely place, Amira's story found a voice. Dr. Yasmin al-Rashid couldn't forget that night at the hospital. She couldn't accept that a child had died in such a way and everyone had simply moved on. She began documenting similar cases, questioning protocols, talking to colleagues. It was Dr. Yasmin who eventually leaked Amira's story to journalist Khalid al-Hamadi. "If we don't talk about it," she said, "how many more Amiras will die in silence?" Khalid's report was published exactly 6 months after Amira's death. The headline was simple but devastating. 12-year-old girl dies in labor after forced marriage. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Within 24 hours, the article was shared over 50,000 times on Yemeni social media. The debate Yemen had avoided for decades had finally erupted in public. Aisha Yoman, a women's rights activist, used Amira's story as a symbol of larger struggle. "This is not an isolated tragedy," she declared. "This is the inevitable consequence of a system that treats girls as commodities. How many more Amira needs to die before we wake up?" Within 3 months, they had identified 47 maternal deaths of girls under 15 in just the previous year. University students organized candlelight vigils. Doctors began speaking publicly about maternity ward horrors. But for every voice calling for change, 2 others rose in defense of tradition. Conservative religious leaders organized counter-protests, arguing that early marriage was sanctioned by Islam and that questioning it was apostasy. Sheikh Abdullah Ahmadi declared, "These westernized women want to destroy our culture. Marriage protects girls from moral corruption. What happened to this girl was the will of Allah, not the fault of our traditions." Activists created hashtag Justice for Amira, which spread beyond Yemen, reaching the Arab world and gaining international attention. The UN included Amira's case in a report on child marriage. But defenders of tradition also organized with hashtag Defend Our Culture and hashtag No to Colonialism. Conservative influencers spread alternative narratives, suggesting Amira had died from pre-existing conditions, not her age. Some even questioned whether she had ever existed, calling the story fabricated propaganda. What made Amira's case different was the irrefutable medical evidence Dr. Yasmin had provided. For the first time, a child's death had become the spark that ignited a national debate Yemen could no longer avoid. The turning point came when Fatima al-Zahra, Amira's mother, decided to break her silence. In a televised interview that went viral, she confirmed every detail of her daughter's story. With tears in her eyes, she said, "I handed my daughter over to death because I thought I was saving our family. Now I live every day knowing I killed my own child." Fatima's testimony was devastating for the deniers. Here was the mother herself confirming every horrific detail. The interview also revealed a shocking detail. Amira was not the first daughter the family had tried to marry off early. An older sister had run away from home at the age 9 when she learned she was being promised in marriage. "Maybe she was smarter than all of us," Fatima admitted. Dr. Yasmin paid a heavy price for her courage. After her identity was revealed, she faced death threats and had to move to another city. Some medical colleagues ostracized her, saying she had betrayed professional trust. But she had no regrets. "If staying silent means other Amiras will die," she said, "then I'd rather face the consequences of speaking out." Khalid al-Haman, the journalist, also faced retaliation. His editor was pressured to fire him. Religious extremists protested in front of the newspaper, but the story had taken on a life of its own. Aisha Yaman, the activist, received direct threats. Unidentified men showed up at her home. Her organization was accused of receiving dirty foreign money to destroy Yemeni culture. But with every threat, more women joined the movement. 1 year after Amira's death, the debate she had inspired still raged. Bills came and went in Parliament. Families began questioning marital arrangements they once would have accepted. Some girls found courage to say no, and some families found courage to listen. Amira al-Zahra had died in silence, invisible and powerless. But her death had become the most powerful voice in the fight against a tradition that devoured its own daughters. In that voice, once set free, proved impossible to silence again. 3 years have passed since a 12-year-old girl died trying to give birth in a Yemeni hospital. But the voice Amira never had in life now echoes louder than ever. Her death was not in vain if we can ensure that other girls have the chance to grow, to learn, to choose, and to live.